Thanks everyone for joining today. I'd like to first start by showing my respects and acknowledging the Bedigal and Gadigal peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which UNSW Sydney's campuses are based, where we are currently today. I'd also like you to extend this respect to any Indigenous or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders or any other Indigenous peoples who may be the traditional custodians of the lands where you are connecting from today. Regardless of whether you're in Australia or overseas, it's always interesting to find out a little bit more about the culture and the community and the language of these people. I know in the Gadigal language, which is who are the traditional custodians of the land on which the Paddington campus of UNSW is based, they have a word which is putua, which means to warm one's hands by a fire and then squeeze gently the fingers of another person. Sounds great, doesn't it? So warm welcome to our first Vaegan seminar for 2022, where we have Professor Mohit Shivdasani, who is an associate professor of bionics and neuromodulation in the Graduate School of Biomedical Engineering at UNSW Sydney. Associate Professor Shivdasani began his bionics career in the field of artificial hearing, developing a brain stimulation device for his PhD awarded in 2009, which morphed into a postdoctoral stint at the Bionics Institute in Melbourne over 8 years that developed Australia's first bionic eye for artificial vision, going from concept to first in-human trials in 3 years. Since 2018, Associate Professor Shivdasani has been at UNSW in a research and teaching capacity and has been continuing to dabble in sight restoration research, as well as developing various other bionic technologies, the newest of which is a device to treat neuroinflammation of the gut for inflammatory bowel disease. Please join me in welcoming him today in spirit, clapping to yourself at home, but I hope you enjoy.
Thank you very much, Juno. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me clearly, and thank you, Juno and Michael, for being in the theatre as well. Very honored to have received this invitation to talk, particularly after learning as well the tribute behind this to a person. And so very honored to be talking here. And thank you, Juno, for that introduction as well. Look, the title's up there of what I wanted to talk about today, and it's a big mouthful, and that's the fault of being an engineer. Because when you're an engineer, you want to have all sorts of disclaimers put up right up the front. And so what I'll be talking about today is quite niche and quite specific. So it is emerging technologies, not all technologies. It is for sight restoration, but some of the technologies may only be applicable to very few conditions. So I've mostly been involved in technologies, the bionic eye, to be exact, which is for central visual pathway dystrophy. So I'm not going to be talking about technologies where the front of the eye, for example, is affected, or the optics of the eye is affected. But there are no doubt technologies out there that will benefit people from those conditions. Juno already gave you a full summary of my history. Here's my version of that history in 6 lines. It's pretty surreal that in 9 days from now, exactly 9 days from now, I will have completed 19 years of being in this country. That's still not half my life. So there you go. I've given you my age now. That's still not half my life, but it's very close. And yeah, I moved into the auditory field. That's where my love of bionics, was seeded. And every time I talk, I love talking about bionics. So that's why when you heard Juno give the introduction, there was a lot of bionics in there. And when I came to UNSW 4 years ago, I said, oh, I've got to be, my title has to have the word bionics in there. And so I forced ahead of school and said, as long as my title can be something in bionics, I'll be happy. I'll take this job. So that's a bit of history there. But yeah, another thing about being an engineer is the naivety sometimes that you come into the medical field with. So I started out in auditory, which is obviously a really important sense for humans. And then when it came to developing a device for vision, on similar lines, I went, how hard can that be? We just take something from out of the ear and we're going to stick it in the eye. So it's just another sense. And I was so naive at that time when I started in 2009. And when I read the first few pages of the textbook of how complex vision can really be, that's when I realized this is not going to be an easy road ahead. But really my love for the bionics, the one thing I love being about in the bionics field, if you've come across me on Twitter, you'll notice even my Twitter handle has the word bionic in there. It's really about working with people who know more than me and who know different things than me. So this is a field where it's absolutely multidisciplinary as it can get. And I've had the pleasure of working with all sorts of flavors of engineers, material scientists, biologists, physicists, you name it. And because it's towards development of a medical device, even talking to regulatory people and lawyers and art designers it's really opened up that developing a medical device takes a lot of effort, but it really takes a lot of complementary effort from multiple disciplines. And that's what I've really loved about being in this field. Of course, for those of you who don't know what bionics is, you may have heard of this big company that exists right here in the heart of Sydney, Macquarie Park. So Cochlear is the world's biggest company developing a bionic ear. It's the world's most sophisticated bionic device by far. And it holds 70% of the world market share. So it's pretty awesome that I can be talking about bionics in Sydney when there's a company about, an hour away developing a real bionic device. Okay, so what I'm really here to talk about today is three main things about vision and blindness from the eyes of an engineer. Some solutions, as I said, that have been that are becoming popular, and an outlook into the future. So when anybody tells you that 100 million people are going to become blind in the next 30 years, that's a pretty staggering and astonishing number. This graph is about 5 years old, and if we are tracking this graph correctly, then truly there will be 100 million blind people. What's worse is, as you see in the animation on the side, is that for a lot of people, it's not a switch off. The blindness doesn't happen as a switch off one day. It's a very progressive thing. For a lot of people, it's very progressive. They're seeing one day and their vision starts to get affected, and then they know that they're slowly going blind, and for some, there's nothing that can be done about it. So it's even just living with that fear, living with that knowledge that your vision perhaps is going to become something like what's playing now can be pretty debilitating. If we look at the data from the World Health Organization, again, astonishing from an engineer's perspective, is that 50% of all blindness can be solved with wearing glasses and then changing the lens. So, but then there's the other 50%, of course, that require further intervention. And central visual pathway deficient dystrophies come within those that other 50%. Okay, so I don't need to go into this. You all are people more than well familiar with this than me. But what I define central visual pathway, I guess we do include the retina in the central visual pathway. So anything in front of the retina would not be part of the central visual pathway, but right from the retina all the way up to the primary visual cortex, where perception first begins, would be considered as the central visual pathway. So any intervention that targets one of these areas would be an intervention applicable to central visual pathway dystrophies. So I'm going to focus on three sort of flavors of technologies. So sensory substitution devices, and I'm going to talk about two devices, and then a little bit of overview of the field of optogenetics, and then lastly, the field that I'm heavily invested in of visual prostheses. Okay, so sensory substitution, I think it was a very well-coined term by perhaps an engineer who said, we're going to build a sensory substitution device. And the reason why it's a nice little term is because the function of the device is exactly what the name is. So the device is going to try and substitute one sense for another, for the one that is lost. In this case, vision. So sensory substitution devices for vision would be taking advantage of other working or heightened senses, hearing or touch perhaps, and would try to deliver visual information through those modalities. The beauty about such devices, they can be non-invasive or semi-invasive. They can be much less expensive than more invasive technologies that might require surgery. And I'll briefly talk a little bit about how these devices could work through cross-modal interactions. Speaking about heightened sense, you may have come across a video of this person. It's an internet sensation. His name is Daniel Kish, and he's an American. And he has this heightened sense of using echolocation to find his surroundings. So when me as an engineer watched this, I just went, "What? He doesn't even need any technology." So yeah, I'll just play this video and see what you think if you haven't seen him before.
I am a man who uses the techniques of a bat to navigate.
Shout out if you can't hear the
I
audio in the video.
No recollection of ever having seen. So we have a structure here that has a roof, a pavilion. I got my first bicycle when I was 6. Go hiking alone in places I don't know. I've traveled to nearly 40 countries. I learned at a very early age that when I click my tongue, I get feedback from the environment all around me. It does not have the degree of definition that is available to vision, but it does have contour, it does have dimension, size, positions of things, layouts of things, and it also has information about texture and density.
So yeah, as I said, extraordinary ability for someone to be able to just navigate using this heightened sense. Perhaps this person, Daniel, would benefit from a device like this because he has a heightened, what I would call a heightened sense of hearing. So this is voice, the first sensory substitution device that I'll cover. And it is really seeing with sound. So the smarts of this device is not really the glasses you see there. That's just a $200 Android glass that you can buy off eBay. The smarts is the software app, which is actually free, that you can just simply load onto this device and start using it. And what this app does is simply scans your environment from left to right, and it converts that visual scene to a two-dimensional soundscape. It's a two-dimensional scene, therefore converts it to a two-dimensional soundscape. And by two-dimensional, I mean changing the frequency of the sound and changing the loudness of the sound. So that's the two dimensions it plays with. And so all it really does is it says, well, if there's an object in two dimensions where one is higher than the other, I'm going to make the higher one higher frequency and the lower one lower frequency. And if there's an object that's brighter than the other, I'm going to make it a louder sound. By using these two dimensions, they convert that scenery. The sound can be transmitted either through earphones or bone conduction, as long as your hearing system, of course, is either heightened or working. And the added benefit is, well, it's not implantable, really less expensive, and could make you look really cool as well, right? So let's play a game. So just to know how this device might work. So I'm going to play a sound, and the image you see is above the sound here. So as I said, it's going to scan from left to right, and therefore, if there's just a horizontal line, hopefully you heard that. And that was basically just a one tone of a single frequency, because as I said, there's no higher or lower. they're all at the same level. All the pixels are at the same level, and so therefore it's just one frequency. But if you had something that changes in height, the sound would be a increasing frequency, but of the same loudness throughout. So because all the pixels are equally bright, but they're changing in height. What if you had 3 lines, vertical lines? Or if you had 1 line and it was just a simple tone, 3 lines is going to be. So it's actually a combination of 3 tones coming together, 3 different frequencies. That's what you're hearing. So the game is now for you to shut your eyes and listen to the next sound and try to guess what it might be. I'll pray the 3rd time. So if you're thinking about this, you go, okay, well, there's clearly a sound, then a gap, then another sound. So it must be 2 objects separated by nothing. If you heard carefully, the first sound is a low frequency sound. The second sound is a bit higher frequency. So the 2 things must be at different heights. Because as I said, a lower height means lower frequency, higher height means higher frequency. And they're probably equally bright because they sound about the same. And if you think about that, you go, well, it's as simple as that. That's what that soundscape is playing. Because it wasn't a pure tone, so it's a garbled tone, so multiple frequencies, but all low, and then multiple frequencies, but all high. Try this one. Any guesses? I can't see the chat, so I'll have to ask Juno to see it. No one submitted anything on the chat. So yeah, so it's a bit more complex, of course, but you hear this choppiness in the sound. So that's what a fence would look like on a soundscape. And now you can figure out why you heard that sound, because the fence has got these very regular vertical, I don't know what they're called, posts, gaps and gaps. That's right. So that's what a fence would sound. Okay, so this is just very simple objects. So if you gave a blind person wearing this and they had to now look at a proper visual scene and had to navigate through that scene, here's what it would sound like for them, for everybody. But here's what it does sound like for an actual visual scene. So what I want you to do is, again, you could keep your eyes open, but shut your eyes every now and then and say, okay, what do we think we're looking at, just based on this thing of low frequencies and high frequencies.
Close to headquarters.
So at first you might go, that is annoying as hell, turn it off, I don't want it. But if you gave this to a blind person and said, try to make sense of it with some training, it works. It really works, because if you remember, as when they showed the fork in the video, the fork was at an upward angle. And so you were hearing this upward sweeping going tone. And when it went to the spoon, it was a slim thing, but the camera was looking at it at a downward angle. And so you heard this low frequency. When you saw the plate right in front of you, it's just this one big warp that goes ahead. So it's pretty astonishing that with some training with this device, it's pretty amazing that $200 device can give you navigation ability just by hearing soundscape. Okay, so that was with the voice. So you can look it up. It's an actual commercial thing. As I said, the app is actually free, and it's used a lot. It's gaining a lot of traction, particularly in the third world economies, because it's giving quite great ability. Okay, so BrainPort's the second sensory substitution device. So this takes advantage not of hearing, but it takes advantage of your somatosensory system, which is the system for touch. So it's actually 20 years since this device was conceived, since the first patent came out. And it's actually a device where that contains a camera. So it's also a commercial device, contains a camera with a headset.
So we have one question here. What is the field of view of the voice device?
It's quite large. I believe it's the camera scans. Don't quote me on this, but it's over 100 something degrees. Yeah.
Usable.
Pretty usable. Yes. Yes. So the BrainPort contains this headset, which of course has to see the visual scene in front of a person. But then it contains this funny looking thing that a person needs to place on their tongue. And if you look carefully, that white block actually has 394 little electrodes. And what this device is doing is taking the visual scene and effectively just pixelizing it into 394 pixels, and then putting little tiny zaps onto those electrodes. And apparently it works. It's a commercial device sold by a company called WeCab. It's a Canadian company. It's commercially available in the countries there. And it really works. And if you see this video, you realize really how it would work.
My name is Misa Meng, and I am the Assistant Director of Low Vision Research here at the Chicago Lighthouse. The current study that we have is working with testing the safety and efficacy of the BrainPort device. The BrainPort V100 is a sensory substitution device for people who are totally blind. So instead of using the eyes to see, they're using their tongue as a platform to take in information.
I was trembling with anticipation when I put the BrainPort on for the first time, and I had to process, why is my tongue buzzing? And Misa, the woman who I work with, said, Andy, let it feed into your head. What are you looking at? Remember, you don't have eyes anymore. And I felt this buzzing on my tongue, and I felt the impression. And then I saw my hand. For the first time in 5 years, I saw my hand. Something that small is huge. And the first person.
So I'm just conscious of time here, so I won't play the whole thing because just realize it's already 27 past. So it works. Go and look it up. There's plenty of stories where people have said it's changed their lives. But then you would argue, is this really vision that you're giving back? To use these devices need a bit of training, of course. It's a new sense almost. You will expect some brain plasticity after long-term use because that sense, other sense is taking over. With the voice app, there actually have been several users who have actually said, this is not just sound. I can actually see. I actually see things. It's not just hearing. Many users have reported this. The official information for the BrainPort company says they don't consider this as vision. It's an oral electronic visual aid, like Braille, but using electricity. But if you look more into this, what's actually happening in these people is probably acquired synesthesia. So it's an acquired perception, and the brains are getting wired, and suddenly the visual cortex may come active when they're actually using this other sense. So this is still new. I mean, we don't know the long-term implications of rewiring people's brains and how they're getting rewired after they're using these devices for a really long time. Okay, so that's about sensory substitution. The world of optogenetics goes into a whole new domain. So optogenetics is actually trying to do something with biology. Okay, so it's trying to bring electronic engineering and genetic engineering together to try and make blind people see again. And the basic premise, and I'm not going to obviously go into the detail, and it's not even my area to go into detail, but all of us in high school biology would have come across this and said, what are cells made of? And they contain some DNA that tells the cell what to do, and that DNA somehow gets translated to messenger RNA, which contains specific proteins, and different cells will express different proteins. So if you can actually put a protein inside a cell, a new protein, and make it express something that it did not do natively, then you have changed the programming of that cell. And that's essentially what optogenetics takes advantage of, by trying to take DNA from another living organism and somehow getting it into the cells of humans. In this case, cells of the eye. And you can do this with multiple ways. You can have the DNA packaged into a viral vector. So the vaccines, for example, the COVID vaccines are packaged into an adenovirus. You can have different viruses, but you can also have non-viral vectors. And this one particular is an interesting one where you have the DNA, you have the cells, you inject the DNA somehow near the cells, and you pass a big electrical current. That electrical current opens the membrane of the cells, and the DNA can get in. So that's electroporation or electrotransfer of DNA. Now, the DNA that you would want to do for an optogenetic application would be something that makes the cell expressive to light. So photoreceptors, of course, are expressive to light, but once they're lost, you can trying to make the other cells that have survived in the eye expressive to light is what you'd be targeting. So DNA from living cells, such as some algae, are actually taken, loaded into a viral vector, loaded into a cell, and if you shine a particular wavelength of light into the eye, those cells start responding magically. And now suddenly, if you think of this, you can open up a whole new range of possibilities, because you can have different wavelengths, and you can try and make different cells reactive to different wavelengths of light. So you can start playing with color and all sorts of things. So it does open up the imagination quite a bit. Does it really work? So this is a paper from last year in Nature Medicine that came out that actually applied this technology. So they used an opsin called Crimson R, which is an amber light, and they actually injected this opsin into a living human, and the human wore this set of goggles, and the goggles effectively projected the visual scene in front of the person as amber light. So it's like a movie projector, but an amber light. And it would make those, they were targeting ganglion cells in this particular study. And so it would make ganglion cells active and ganglion cells on fire. And they tested this person on various visual tasks. And, as you saw before with the sensory substitution devices, such a device can allow a person to do basic things like detecting objects or navigating a simple obstacle course. When using those goggles. Now, this is a video of, I'm not going to play this video. It exactly explains what I just said, but in video form. So just in the interest of time, the link's down there, so you can always just go and look it up and see it. But yeah, this video just explains the basics premise of optogenetics.
Do algae hold?
Okay, so I really want to get to this third technology, because obviously I'm very heavily invested in this one, which is visual prostheses or electrical stimulation of the visual pathway. The premise behind such technologies are now going even one step further. So it's not playing with genetics anymore. It's actually involves quite a bit of heavy engineering, working with the compromised biology, very, very compromised biology. So some of you may know the retina is very highly specialized structure, full of intricate networks. And whenever Michael tells me how much degeneration can really screw up the retina, and that says, don't tell me, because I get more and more worried, because this thing is not going to work with a compromised retina. But the idea, when the idea began of a visual prosthesis, it seemed quite simple, because all it said was the photoreceptors are gone, but if you can get an electrode in there somehow and electrically activate the remaining surviving cells, every electrode you activate will create a spot of light like this. And of course, if you create multiple spots, you can create an image. But then why stop at the retina? You could do the same thing in the brain. You could, in the LGN, you could do this on the optic nerve. You could do this in the visual cortex. So there are devices that target these different areas, all fall under the banner of visual prosthesis. If you actually look back at history and say, well, where did this come from? It dates back all the way to 1755, where Charles Leroy, a French physician, took a static electricity jar, they're called the Leyden jar, hooked it up to one of his patients, I think, and yeah, the patient had been blind, but when that static electricity went through that patient's head, the patient saw something. It was actually, that's the description written in Leroy's paper. So that was, I think, the very first evidence that you can pass electricity through someone's head, give them a big jolt, probably give them a big jolt, and that wasn't written on the transcript, but at least it made the person see. What you might not know is that Australia was very early on into this. And the very first patent for a retinal implant came from Melbourne by this surgeon, Graham Tassica. And he actually went and implanted something in a human between the choroid and the sclera. And this thing was light sensitive. So it would just basically was like a photodiode implant. It was light sensitive. And in response to light, it would produce a little tiny electricity packet, and that would activate cells. And this particular person was able to get, appreciation of light back. So there was a patent, 1955. Not many know that Australia was the pioneer. So go Aussies. Fast forward to 2022. And there's over 40 groups worldwide and at least 7 active companies in this space. So it's a huge field. It's obviously, moment you think about a bionic eye, that's just become a buzzword for many people. And it's really huge. And it's fascinating. It's amazing to see, and it's great to see that there's such big money being poured into this. Okay, so I told you about how I've already told you about how this thing would work. So again, you need a pair of glasses, see the visual scene, and using that information from the video, you would go and electrically stimulate different areas of the retina, and you would try and create these phosphenes or those punctate spots of light. And hopefully, just like a TV monitor or an old TV monitor, very low resolution TV monitor would make the scenery as a pixelated view of the world. Okay, does that happen? Well, the thought was that yes, if we can just get more pixels in there. So this then started a pixel race. So if you see 3 images here, they're pixelated images, of course. You may recognize something from these, some parts of these, you might not recognize the full thing. But if I go more pixels, you obviously start to get much more information. So each one of those dots requires to be a punctate spot of light that you create by electrically activating just a tiny population of cells in the retina. And then you can, of course, once you reach this many pixels here, you can pretty much know what the image is. Okay. Many of you may have already heard about the Australian efforts to build a bionic eye. You may have seen lots of media stories and interviews and this and that. I'm here to try and filter out the misinformation, try to give you the most accurate information of what actually happened in Australia. So 2008 was the time, bless that someone who whispered into the ears of Kevin Rudd that wouldn't it be great that by 2020, Australia builds a bionic eye. And so Kevin Rudd was sold, and in 2009 or 2010, the ARC gave out $60 million to 2 groups, one $50 million that I was part of, and another to the Monash University for building a cortical implant. So that was where the first segregation of money happens. Of course, when there's big money like $50 million, there's many stakeholders, and so immediately it became aware that lots of stakeholders were wanting to get a chunk of that money. And so I was in Melbourne at that time at the Bionics Institute, and along with the Centre for Eye Research Australia, we actually took a device to phase 1 trial, incubated a startup company and then have done a second trial in Melbourne. At that time, UNSW actually was also doing efforts. They were building a different kind of bionic eye with more channels, but that stopped at preclinical evaluation, and it's now part of it is moved to University of Sydney. And then the University of Melbourne decided that they'd go a slightly different approach where they'd build a device out of diamond and put it on directly on the surface of the retina as opposed to suprachoroidal, which is between the sclera and choroid. And that also got stuck in preclinical evaluation before the money dried up. So the problem was the money dried up for a lot of these projects, and so they really didn't go anywhere. This project was the only one that really continued on. Okay, so I'm not going to say all the 3 years of preclinical animal studies that I was fortunate to be a part of, but 2009 we began the research. 2012 we were ready for humans, and the device was very crude. It didn't contain any electronics. This is an electrode array that has to be implanted in the suprachoroidal space of the eye, and the electrode is actually externalized to the head. So the patient actually would come to the lab and we would plug in the patient to the stimulator to be able to actually activate electrodes on the array. Of course, none of this could have happened without a big multidisciplinary team. And so it was really first in human at that time, because it was first in human for a suprachoroidal device. And we learned a lot. We learned absolutely heaps. Out of 95 participants, 3 participants were chosen for this study. All had pretty much no form vision at all left, and they'd be blind for at least 10, 20 years, only bare light perception. And all of them used the guide dog, as well as the cane, of course, for navigation, day-to-day navigation. If you can see carefully, after surgery, you can actually see the electrode array behind the retina. So it's actually behind the choroid, and between the choroid and the sclera is where the electrode is placed. So this is one participant before and after surgery. So we tried to get the device quite close to the fovea, at least the tip to as close as possible to the fovea. Turns out if you go too close, you start to get a retinal fold here because of the optic disc. So this was the maximum that it could go in. It had a field of view of about 20 degrees in terms of coverage of on the retinal area. So fairly okay, and it had 24 electrodes, each of which could be activated. This is another infrared image and an OCT image showing the retina overlaid on top of those electrodes, which is quite amazing to see. Okay, as I said, patients had to be plugged in to be able to actually do something with this device. So at first we were very basic, connected it up, told the patient, we stimulate this electrode, what can you see? The answer we were hoping for, nice round punctate dot. The answer we got was bananas and ducks. And so a bit perplexing at first. This is the actual drawing of the percept by the participant by just stimulating one electrode. And another colleague of mine, Nick Sinclair, was the first author of this paper, had to do some creativity and say, yes, she does see bananas and ducks. It is true. They're not round phosphines. And when we tried this in the second participant, of course, so this is with 20 electrodes. Red shows participant 1 for that electrode. Blue shows the percept drawn by participant 2 for that electrode. And you can see, apart from some of them that do give you a round looking percept, pretty much most of them are very complex. They're far from round. I mean, look at this.
Mate, wouldn't you expect that, given the fact that you've got random depth of ganglion cells and you've got a massive electrode? So the underlying pathway is going to be totally different for each electrode.
Absolutely.
So
we didn't have a person expert in retinal degeneration tell us this. Tell the world this. That we thought of, there's 1 million ganglion cells, they're all there. So if we have 1 million electrodes, each one can target each ganglion cell, we've done it. We'll create 1 million pixels and they'll all be punctate and very focused. Turns out not the case. So then we started scratching our heads and, well, what can we do with these odd looking percepts? And so some of us said, well, why don't we try this? You can actually try and evoke these percepts in a sequential fashion, one by one. And yes, each of them will look really nasty and crappy, but what if you evoke them really fast, in a fast fashion? Then potentially the participant would not have to concentrate on the individual shape of every percept. They would all sort of merge together and you could try and still create an object using that. And that's what we went with. That's exactly what we went with. And we started trying things. So, remember it was a joining the dots game. We would sit with the participant and stimulate a sequence of electrodes, like here on the 20 electrode device, and say, what do you see? And then we change the sequence, go, what do you see? And we'd make the participant draw it. And this is what they would say, and verbally say and draw. This was an interesting one. They said, I see a Z, but it's really not a Z. It's kind of like he didn't know what to say, but he said it's a mathematical symbol. Yeah, he said it's a mathematical symbol. And I said, yeah, it says backwards mathematical symbol. So when we saw this happening, we started going, we were a bit more relieved because we were really worried when we saw those nasty single electrode percepts. Okay, so what can patients do with these percepts? This was the job we gave Centre for Eye Research Australia and said, go and test these patients and what they can do and what they can't do in the real world. So Centre for Eye Research said, well, we haven't really developed this. We don't know what to test them on. Can't test them on an acuity chart. So they have to develop these entire suite of tests to actually test people with low vision, because these participants are still with low vision. So they came up with this Lovada protocol, which is published. It actually contains 4 mobility tasks, 10 ADL tasks, a quality of life questionnaire, a whole suite of things put together, and was validated, of course, in RP patients without a device. And then they applied this protocol to the patients who got the device. And then they said, well, we can't do these tests in your lab because some of them involve mobility. So build us a system that actually allows us to test these patients outside of the lab. So the engineering team had to go back and actually say, well, now we've got this electrode inside the participant. How do we get all our gear on the participant? So participants literally wore a backpack with batteries bought from Bunnings down here, hooked up to the backpack, running an iMac. There's an iMac inside the backpack, which is actually processing with the video scene from the camera and streaming information to the stimulator, which then zapped those electrodes inside the person. And the person could walk around and use this device. And that's when they started putting the participants through tasks like these. So this is one of the O&M tasks, which involved route navigation. Fortuitously, the 2 hospitals, or the Barnix Institute and the Eye and Ear Hospital, where the patients were implanted, in St. Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, have actually an underground tunnel where it's used for transport of prisoners between the hospitals. And we said, perfect spot to test patients because it's this evenly lit tunnel and we can place objects, build an obstacle course, and we actually have some controls and test the patients in a proper way. So here's one of our participants, Diane Ashworth, our very first participant. She's using the device. She's got the camera strapped to the head, and she's using the device to navigate through this obstacle course. And I just want you to, as you're watching, think about how you would navigate such a course. So looking at this, you would go, wow, she aced it. No guide dog, no white cane, and she was able to successfully navigate those obstacles. But what you would have noticed is how much time she spent at every pause, looking, scanning her head from left to right, trying to discern that information, that those funky looking percepts, and then making a conscious decision of whether she should take a step ahead or not. You would say it's not vision. This is not how a person with vision would navigate the course. A person with vision would just walk through. A person with a guide dog, the guide dog will just walk through. It's almost like a cane where instead of tapping the things, you are trying to scan the things. Yes, it's giving you a visual percept, but ultimately you need to have the scanning. So this made us really realize what sort of a device this really is. And this is the data. We measured like contacts with obstacles. Participants, when the one thing we couldn't do is blind the participants to whether the device was on or off. Because if the device was off, they knew it's off because there's no visual percepts at all. So many patients, at least I know the second participant, he would just walk through the whole course and don't care about banging into obstacles at all. And he'd go, I want to do this in the quickest time possible. So he'd just rush through. And that's why it takes so less time when the device is off. But when the device is on, all that scanning is to start. So it takes longer to be able to avoid those obstacles. Another task, very simple, door touch or simulation of a door touch. The door's in the room somewhere, go and find it and touch it. Quite simple. So the device was very, very effective at giving someone the ability to go and find a high contrast door somewhere in the room. This was another task that Sarah came up with and said, we're going to do this gallery task and ask patients to recognize what these objects are. And I said, you can do that, but I can tell you now as a design engineer who's seen these, who's worked with these participants and knows what those percepts look like, you're just going to embarrass us going because none of them are going to be able to recognize what these things are with those crude percepts. What about ADLs? These are some of the ADLs that we looked at. Can you sign in a box, a little box? Can you look at a clock and tell the time? Can you pick objects on the shelf? Can you recognize gestures? Some of these, the device was great at, absolutely great at. One particular one that I like was sorting socks. Patients were able to go white socks, black socks, gray socks. Very, very quick, really quick at sorting socks. I went, great, like, you know, if that's something that floats your boat, you want to sort socks all day, this device will allow you to do that very, very effectively. One participant was quite good at guessing. So the first one, she'd actually scan through and go, I see an edge here. I scan a little bit. I see another edge. It's a wide looking thing. And I know it's on a shelf, in a kitchen shelf. So it must be a box of some sort. Whereas when I see a slim thing, it could be a bottle. And so she was quite good at picking these cues up, but she was not seeing the bottle. She was not actually seeing the box. She was literally seeing those percepts, and she had to make sense of those percepts to be able to make sense of the world. If you're interested in more discussion of is this really vision, I would invite you to read these couple of articles, one written by us, one on the conversation, and then this paper that came out as well. And they really interviewed participants in the paper to ask them what they really saw. And turns out, you know what? It's like a new language that they have to learn. It is completely artificial. It is not vision. You know, you can call it functional vision, you can call it artificial vision, you call it something else, but you don't call it vision. Diane actually went across to write a book on her experience called I Spy with My Bionic Eye, and it's on Amazon, so you can actually buy it if you want to learn about what she actually experienced. And then where it went from there is we registered a startup called Bionic Vision Technologies. And then the Chinese came in and said, we'll give you money. We couldn't find any Australian investors, but the richest person in Hong Kong said, here's 18 million US to incubate as an incubation money for this company. And this company has then done things. So we went from a backpack device to now fully implantable It's got the stimulators and electronics in the head. It's got the glasses. The patient wears a little unit on the belt. They can actually take things home. Okay, I'm nearly done.
So is this the one that just is being used recently?
Correct. So this is twice as many electrodes.
This is from the left-hand side branch. You remember earlier you had 3 parts?
It's from the left-hand side branch.
On the left-hand side.
So it's a continuation of the first Melbourne trial. We call it the second Melbourne trial. So a new set of 4 participants. This is a short video, which I will play. It appeared on Current Affairs just September last year.
It's history making that's going to change the lives of vision impaired people.
Great-grandmother Colleen Knowles is one of millions robbed of their sight due to a genetic condition of the retina.
We live on foreshore. I can look out over the bay and know whether there's any boats out there on the bay, whereas without the device on, I don't even know there's a... Technically, I know there's water and sand, but I wouldn't be able to tell you with the naked eye.
And while the technology hasn't completely restored sight, it's given wearers a new lease on life, allowing them to see flashes of light like this. Another trial participant is seen here navigating his local shopping centre.
I'm 66 now. I first got diagnosed when I was about 7, and it's gradually got worse over those 60 years.
For grandfather Mark Boyd, it's been the little things like going to the theatre.
I would perhaps stand in the foyer and I'd hear people around me, but I wouldn't be able to know, except by sound, how close. But with the device, you could sit in there and you could scan around and you'd know, oh, someone's there, someone's there.
Where we used to live, there were a lot of trees in the nature strip. Now, I'd lived there for about 7 or 8 years and I never knew that there were trees in that nature strip. But once I put the device on, I was able to, appreciate that that landscape was there. And then I was getting the trees on the other side of the road.
Colleen still vividly remembers her switch on day.
Probably the first 7 or 8 times, 9 times maybe, they were saying, can you see anything? No, 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 no. And then all of a sudden, it's, oh! And my family were in another room watching it through CCTV. So it was exciting for them as well. Because I was sitting there thinking, oh, it hasn't worked. And yeah, it did work.
The cutting-edge surgical technique involves placing an implant on the skull, which attaches via a lead to electrodes within the back of the eye. The glasses have 2 cameras capturing footage that's sent to this unit, which converts the video into an electrical impulse. That then passes back to the skull onto the device in the eye, which stimulates existing tissue, helping wearers see.
They would be able to identify obstacles so that they could avoid them whilst walking along.
This is another patient, Sefa, sorting out the different colours of his laundry.
You got them all right?
100%.
Wow.
It's the next frontier when it comes to digital medicine and medical technology.
So I'll stop that video again. You can look it up on YouTube, but I think you get the sense of what this can do. Of course, long way ahead, but I would right now place it as an electronic visual aid, right? Penny Allen, the lead surgeon, said, identify obstacles. I would really say detect obstacles, because we're not at the recognition stage yet with such few electrodes. We're increasingly seeing they can detect obstacles really easily. So can they with the voice app, $200 voice app, right? So it's a food for thought to think on. But what's amazing is that there are multiple options. And of course, the FDA is looking at this very carefully. This is from 18 days ago that BVT, the company, actually developed, actually was granted a breakthrough device designation to do further work and get it into the market. Okay, so lastly, I just want to end on the summary.
How much?
How much?
It's $200. $200.
$200.
This is more than 200.
It's way more than 200. I reckon the device is going to be priced close to 100K with all the fitting and rehab and surgery and everything. It's going to be at least 100K. Yeah. So yeah, if you have a spare 100K, and you wanted visual percepts. Perfect, and you didn't want the soundscape, but you wanted actual visual percepts. This thing will give you visual percepts. Okay, very promising future, very amazing time to be in this field because, as I said, multiple technologies, tailored technologies for different causes, some expensive, some not. For optogenetics, I really feel it's very early days to take a call because, we don't know the genetic implications yet of doing genetic manipulation as such. Michael's here and he will always say the remodeling of the retina after disease. That's your hardest thing to crack for any technology that wants to reactivate the retina in some way. But everyone has a role to play and hopefully this multidisciplinary effort will continue. And the reason why it should continue is this photograph. This is a photograph of Diane. It was completely not scripted. I can vouch for it. It's when we took her into the cafe for the first time with the device, with the backpack. And we were behind the barista and she interacted with the barista. And this was her reaction when seeing the barista or seeing whatever perceptual image she got of the barista. So I think we all have a role to play and we all should keep striving. Just don't look up is the solution. So thank you all for listening. I'm sorry we went up, over time. I thought I'll keep to 45 to 50 minutes, but we've gone over time. But I'd be really happy to take any questions. But thanks, guys, for listening.
I'm assuming that your microphone is picking up. If anyone has any questions, please unmute and go ahead.
I've got one final question. I don't really have a problem with the concept that you keep on proposing about whether it comes in through auditory or whatever it is. I remember many years ago when I was in Houston, the graduate program, one of our professors said, well, if you show a Russian, I don't know what it's a Russian, an A, sort of and they'll look at an A like this, not making it a square, that's a house, a roof of a house. They don't, in their language, whatever it may be, it could be Russian or whatever, any country. They look at that and it's meaningless to them. Right? So the analogy I have is that's exactly what's happening where you've got information coming in about visual space that is coming through a different system. And if you're fully sighted, you just don't understand that. Just like that guy, I've seen him on the news, I've seen him over and over again, so it's amazing, where he's using a different percept to navigate very successfully.
Correct.
So it's just, I think it's a concept that maybe we struggle, the fully sighted struggle, more so than if you got nothing. You got no sensory input through your vision and it's coming through, and then you have to use that. So I think it's just part of the learning process, and it may be the success of these will depend on the training rather than all the other stuff that goes on. Yeah. And I think the next step is, I think you and other engineers have been looking, oh, we've got to get this right, fantastic. But I think it's the training part to teach someone a different language. That's it. So it's more a common.
No, absolutely. I fully spot on. I mean, we keep saying sight restoration, and we keep harking about we have to restore sight like it was. And the answer to that is probably not. If you give a level of functional vision that allows a blind participant to drive their car again, who cares if it's through their eye or through another modality or through stimulation of the tongue or anything, if it can give them back that functionality. So I think engineers are aware of this, and they are moving towards going, well, what is the level of functionality we can give back using a given piece of technology? If the functionality, so we assume that bionic eyes would actually give you the highest level of functionality because it would give you the highest possible resolution. We were wrong in the beginning, but there's still work to be done. And so I think it is, if you can make someone read an acuity chart through a soundscape and they get below 2200, you would say they're not legally blind anymore, right? So So yeah, I totally agree. It is about functional vision. It's about, doesn't matter through what sense. And when we talk to participants, they go, thank you, still thank you, because you know what, I had nothing. And you gave me crappy looking percepts. I'll take it.
I have a question from Marlene. She's asking the effectiveness of the system really depends on having an intact visual system, basically. What happens in situations where you may have some atrophy cortex or retrograde degeneration? What approaches, are there any adaptations that can be made? And also, would that be a limiting factor?
Yeah, great question, Marlene. Thanks for that question. Look, absolutely. I think the technology is going to be the use of the technology is going to be highly dependent on every individual and what they have lost effectively. So at least in the electrical stimulation world, we say if you have a functioning optic nerve, and it doesn't matter if you have a dead retina, if you have surviving retinal ganglion cells, we'll go and zap those. If you have glaucoma and your optic nerve gets dystrophied, we'll go to the LGN or the brain and stimulate the brain directly. And I don't know if for those following, 2 days ago in Chicago, a patient has received the very first intracortical visual cortex device. It's just been implanted 2 days ago, came out on the news in Chicago. So we're still to learn what that person can see, of course, but yeah, if you have brain problems, then it's a whole new ball game. And so you have to think differently. You probably have to go to some sensory substitution thing where your visual sense, you can no longer rely on the visual pathway to be processing the information. You've got to switch to another sense. So I think, but like I said earlier, I think it's amazing that you can think of these other options. And so everyone, every person suffering from any sort of condition that affects the visual pathway might have an option out there.
Vincent's got a question just about, is there any sort of like outreach training that's provided to people once they're fitted with the device for learning this new language, essentially?
That's such a critical question you've asked, Vincent, because if you ask this question to a device company, the answer they will give you, it's going to cost money. Sending every patient to rehabilitation, spending where that money has to come from somewhere. So I think that is going to be one of the bottlenecks. Any technology that requires a significant amount of rehabilitation cost associated with it, commercially, it's going to be hard to be viable and tell investors that this is a really good technology to pump money in. You want a technology that almost plug and play, works on day one, and go off, and you can sell a lot of these. So from an ethical standpoint, absolutely, we had to spend a lot of time with our participants, giving them different objects to play with, touch, feel, look with the device, and then make that mind map in their head to then go before we let them out in the world. And we had to do that to make the device work even what it works. But is this commercially viable? When I talk to people at Cochlear, make the bionic ear, they have one session with the audiologist, maximum a couple of sessions after the implant. Audiologist fits the implant, off they go, they're hearing. That's when it really becomes commercially viable. So I think there's always going to be this this issue with technologies like these. The more technologies that require very much rehabilitation might have a sour face when you go to investors asking for more money, and that'll increase the device cost.
Yeah, exactly. Health tech evaluation and usability sort of needs to be ongoing. Yeah, just with the training. So I noticed that she was tended to rotate her head rather than like generating motion parallax. I imagine there's not much you can get in terms of motion parallax type information that you could use to sort of like estimate information.
No, that's right.
I imagine that sorting of socks just depends on holding something that feels like a sock, and I can't see an image of it, so therefore it must be black. Is that correct?
So yeah, a white sock would evoke bright percepts. Lo and behold, a black sock would evoke very dim or no percepts.
But it does create this interesting question of like how much information do you need in order to start to resolve other things like other material properties of objects, like surfaces, like socks, feel generally like matte, but you had something that was a little bit more reflective, had a certain sheen or gloss to it. You'd be able to resolve that because it sort of like dynamically change in particular ways. As you physically know, based on haptic information, how you're changing it relative to a fixed lighting environment. And there were changes in luminance that were sort of like violating what we normally expect for a diffuse completely matte surface. So there's a potential.
Yeah. And look, you just made me think of another point in a lot of these technologies can actually be multimodal now. You can use two technologies in conjunction. There's no reason why not. There's no reason why you can't use a voice app and your bionic eye device to get more information about the thing you're looking at, and be better at what you're seeing, right? So I think future is bright.
Future is bright. That's a good way to end. Well, thank you so much, Mohit, and thank you everyone for joining today's Vaegan seminar.
Yeah, thanks again, guys, and hopefully we can have everyone back on campus very soon. I'll be great.